Analogous Propinquity this week takes on the issue of a little bit of history. The history as we have lived it, if you happen to be a room full of three old guys, myself, Paul Baker, Jim Bowers, former chair of the political science department at a place that we don't name, and Arnie Rothschild, a man who is a marketing genius and has been at it for a good long time and has dabbled in horse racing as well. So we have some references on all of these things coming up in this segment.
And he's a true man among men.
Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian sociologist back in the 20th century, coined the phrase, "the medium is the message," which is to state that it isn't so much what we are consuming as far as messaging is concerned, but it is how that message is delivered. The instrumentation of that actually changes in some way the message or augments it. So since World War II, the medium has indeed changed. And we opened this segment with that newsreel music in the background, which is a reminder that it wasn't all that long ago that messaging wasn't always in front of us.
Absolutely true. So if you think for a second back to the election of 1960, when for the first time we had a televised debate, televised and also on radio, between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. The interesting thing was that the people that watched the debate thought that Kennedy won. The people that listened to the debate thought that Nixon won. And so that kind of underscores your premise, that Kennedy took time to go be in the sun and get tanned. Nixon had a heavy beard, did not want makeup on. They looked totally different. One young and vibrant, one not user-friendly, if you will. And yet on radio, based on people's understanding of what was being said, they had a totally different sense of who won that debate. And that was a pivotal moment, by the way, in national election messaging.
Well, yeah, but to go back a little farther, because when you said I think you said we're not always in front of it or something like that. If you go back even farther, before the advent of electronic media, what you see is the classic torchlight parade, where it's more of a entertainment event as well. It's a partisan entertainment event. And you also see back, when you're talking about the late 19th century, the print media would be partisan media. It would be, there's reasons why you have names like Democrat in a newspaper, like the local paper here, the Democrat and Chronicle. I would suspect that the Democrat used to be a separate paper, and it was a partisan paper. And so you end up getting that message delivered. It's in front of you, but it was in front of you in a totally different way. So not trying to correct you, but it's like, but you've got these different types of entertainment.
And again, I mean, to go back to that phrase, the medium is the message. Yes, going back and New York City in that day, I can't remember how many newspapers there were. How many newspapers are there in New York City now? I mean, seriously, there's one newspaper in New York City.
I would say 3, but okay.
Well, and here again, that gets us into the next question, which is who's consuming and how does that impact the choice of medium for the message? And Arnie, we worked in broadcasting for a lot of years, and I can tell you right now, there's a whole big difference between the way I can tell a story in print and the way I've got to structure that story for radio. And then again, if I'm going to take that story over to television, totally different methodology.
One of the things that's really interesting about the evolution into electronic messaging with elections is that over time we morphed more towards likability and relatability than policy. So
that good-looking tanned young man.
yeah, and the thing that I've won 41 judicial elections. In judicial elections, you can't deal with any questions of policy or how someone may rule. And it's totally image-based. And then the question becomes, we went through one period of time where imaging with robes and crossed arms and jail cell doors slamming and,
And the ubiquitous American flag.
oh yeah, that always the American flag. And I did a Supreme Court race. God, it's got to be 16 years ago. And I had a very young, good-looking candidate who was a city court judge, appointed, had never, he was appointed to that judgeship, with a young wife who was pregnant, and we were running against a sitting Supreme Court justice, and he was going to do the old, I call it ugly bear, crossed arms and the robes kind of thing. And I took my candidate, recognizing that I was going to drive this primarily on television, and had him walking through a park, pushing a baby carriage with a pregnant wife next to him, and then some images of his running up courthouse steps and the young and vibrant and relatable judicial candidate. And the first line that I used, by the way, in the ads was, "So-and-so is one of us." So I went for the broad middle rather than the traditional judicial look, because my assumption was that people wanted, if they were to appear in court, to believe that the judge understood who they were and what their life was about. And for me, that was a pivotal election. The opponent was someone who had never lost an election, had been in the Assembly, the state Senate, had been the district attorney from his county, had been elected Supreme Court, and was then in the appellate division. And we overwhelmingly beat him.
Which gets us to the question of who are we and who is the receiver of the message as well. Now, what you just said, I wonder, would that have worked as well in the 1950s as it might have in the 1960s or 70s?
And the answer is it absolutely would not have worked. When you do messaging in politics, you're doing messaging in the moment. And that moment always changes and evolves. And you have to make a determination as to what your desired imaging is with any candidate. So I have, and again, as we speak, we have in the geography in which we live, a county executives race. And one of the things that I'm struggling with my candidate is, how do I criticize policy of the incumbent without going negative, without my candidate being perceived as a negative messenger? And one of the lines that I wrote is, "We can do better." So I can criticize the policy and just say we can do better. The problem is that ultimately, in today's environment of messaging, we have an incumbent and I have the challenger, and I have to figure out a way to convince a voter that they are going to fire the incumbent and hire the challenger without making women voters, who will be 53.5 or 54% of the vote, without them thinking that my guy's mean.
The way you ended it gets back, I think, to Paul's comment, is that you're having to address who we are in your candidate, particularly given the environment you're running in. A Republican candidate running in a county that is, I think, pretty much considered Democrat now, in terms of who we've elected in recent years and things. And that means you have to tone down the partisanship to a degree as well, which means you may have to tone down the rhetoric also. You can't be as mean.
So, you just said something that's really interesting, that yes, by registration, this county is significantly higher in Democratic Party registration. But I find it interesting that the perception is that we are fundamentally a Democratic governed county. We lost the county executive's race 3 years ago. Up until then, it had been a Republican-controlled county. To this day, even though it requires a cross-caucusing premise, the majority of the legislature is still Republican. But there's a huge difference between the county and the city.
Yes.
And so, were you to say the city is dramatically Democratic Party controlled, as many and most cities, the Northeast are right now, that's different than the perception that the geography is Democratic.
And to build on that, that works in most of the major cities in the nation, and in all cities to a certain degree. I think that you have what are referred to as inner ring and outer ring suburbs, and the inner ring suburbs tend to really be a battleground as far as who's going to control that. The further out you go, it seems the more conservative the voting becomes.
And no question that that's true. And let me just reframe that. A lot of that voting, and again, I'm speaking to the part of the state that we're sitting in, a lot of that voting that drives the conservative growth is really anti-city voting as opposed to, philosophical voting. So
the urban elite.
Yeah, the urban elite.
Give them a name.
But this part of New York State, the part that we're sitting in, is really fascinating. All one has to watch right now is the argument about what to do with immigrants coming into New York State. As you watch counties pass
emergency declarations.
Yes, emergency declarations.
And New York City's Mayor Eric Adams is about to sue the rest of New York State.
And it's going to drive another realignment. And I said in earlier conversations that we've had that we have to learn new messaging disciplines in this moment in time, because you don't talk to the base to win. You're going to have to talk to unaffiliated and what people consider to be blanks right now. And what I keep trying to measure is how this one issue drives voter behavior. And the problem is you can't poll it, because people don't want to say or answer positively in a poll, yeah, I'm kind of bigoted.
Right.
I'm kind of bigoted.
Yeah, definitely not in my backyard, right. But something ought to be done about this.
Well, but that ties into, you even see this in different ways to play off of that. Who are we? And you are correct. And I wasn't trying to, ignore like the county legislature, but I can think of the 37 years I've been in this area. And again, listener, not trying to make this so micro about where we live that it's not of interest to you, but you probably can see this in your own areas. I think of Brighton, for example. When I came here 37 years ago, or 35, whatever it was, Brighton was a pretty solid Republican town. And that's flipped, particularly as my white liberal friends, who I consider myself to be a liberal, can't have our kids in city schools. So they take a solidly Republican town at one point like Brighton and turn it into a solidly Democratic town, because they really don't want to live their principles by staying in the city. So they escape, and they basically change the political dynamics of community.
So let's
whole nother season, but
but let's confront the elephant in the room, because this is also part of that question of who are we, and that gets into the demography, and a lot of what you're talking about was also referred to as white flight.
Yeah, white flight.
There was something interesting, by the way, if you back up time and just to address the the Brighton issue. We back up time to an election when a lady named Maggie Brooks was running for county executive against the sitting mayor of the city of Rochester, Bill Johnson. And two things happened. One was a commercial called Pac-Man, yes. where the imaging was the Pac-Man character eating the towns because Mayor Johnson had proposed a consolidation of services. And the second thing that happened was a robbery, a burglary, an armed robbery at Mann's Jewelers around 2 weeks before the election, where some people from Cleveland walked in and at gunpoint robbed Mann's Jewelers. And as a result of that, if you go back and look at the voting in Brighton, Maggie Brooks ran inordinately great numbers because people were concerned that crime was coming to Brighton. And it was a fascinating dynamic. It was the local later version of Willie Horton.
Yeah, and in that case, too, it makes you wonder, too, and for the listener who didn't know, Bill Johnson was the first African-American mayor of Rochester. This would have made him the first African-American county executive. And I'm wondering if his own race reinforced that fear of crime.
Voters are in no small part hypocrites. About some some things.
I agree.
It goes back to the not in my backyard idea. This is going to be a significant political issue as we move forward. Just as the role of school boards and the responsibility of parents in raising their children is, in my view, next year going to be the most explosive issue that we're going to deal with in elections all over New York State.
Glenn Youngkin, here we come.
Well, I grew up with the person that Glenn Youngkin beat, Terry McAuliffe, who lost an election, and he's from Syracuse originally, by the way, lost the election by saying parents should not have a role in their children's education. That really crossed a whole lot of boundaries in parents' minds. And we're there again, in New York State, and it's getting more and more dramatic.
And in that case, there wasn't a medium that he could use, any kind, radio, television, social. Nothing was going to fix that.
All right. Now, though, I do want to point out that in a day gone by, perhaps Terry McAuliffe could have overcome that, but when it is retweeted exponential times per day, your comment takes on a whole lot more weight than it did in 1982.
How about in 1948, Harry Truman set out on a train tour of the United States. And what would happen, I went to college in Iowa, and so the train would arrive in Ottumwa, Iowa, and the next stop on the railroad, by the way, would be Fairfield, Iowa. And so the elected officials from Fairfield would get on the train in Ottumwa, and then as the train arrived in Fairfield, they looked like they had been on the train with the president. That was the image they wanted to portray. And while the president was giving his speech in the back of the train, the elected officials from Mount Pleasant, Iowa, were getting on that no one could see, so that in the next stop, they would be seen as close to the president as well. Totally different, and it was to play the local newspaper, and it was the photo op for the local newspaper. But to your point, I think that I saw the President of the United States fall over 100 times in the last few days at the Air Force Academy graduation. So that was not just on television, it was tweeted, it was on every news feed. And now, by the way, you're going to see that by text message and SMS.
I'm surprised that hasn't become a meme yet. I haven't seen it.
Oh, it is.
I haven't seen one, but it will be if it isn't.
There actually is a version of it that shows Donald Trump on a golf course hitting a golf ball, and then the golf ball hits the president in the back of the head and he falls down on the stage.
I don't think I probably follow those pages, but
That was on Twitter.
But again,
it's on Twitter. I don't I don't tweet
but again,
or twit.
that is a generational thing as well, because I think the three of us in this room, unless we're in the business of having to be on social media and to follow social media, we're not there.
Right.
Not the way that our children and grandchildren are there.
But go ahead.
No, but it gets to be an important point. So as we approach an election cycle, by virtue of what I have to do to consult an election, I have to be watching all of the social media feeds, I have to watch Twitter, I have to listen to every radio station again to see how they've changed. I have to be aware of exactly what's going on with not only network television, but cable television as I try to message. I also have to watch issues from around the country every morning, reading Real Clear Politics, which is a website. And then there's also a similar web that they aggregate stories. And there's also a similar one in New York State called the Empire Report, because these currents, if you will, are constant and moving. So and it gets to an interesting point, Paul, and to you, Doctor, you may not watch them, but I can mobilize that message and direct it to a medium that you do watch.
Right.
And I can get to you. So, and the thing is that given our relative ages in the room, for example, Facebook has become a very effective messaging delivery system for many of us.
And particularly, given that Facebook started out as for youngsters, that it's increasingly 40 and above.
There's no question that's true, and it gets older all the time.
Right.
And then you have to fill in underneath. Although, in all fairness, spending a lot of time looking at voters below the age of 35 it is kind of wasting resources.
Right. But I want to, Paul, if I may, I want to go back to a couple things you said, which brings us a little more back directly to this. In the example, there's a couple things that strikes me here. In the example of Harry Truman, you said an important word, local papers. Part of this change in media landscape is the loss of the truly local paper. Then, from the viewpoint that you're talking about with the having to follow social media. So if we think about the quick history of, let's just keep it simple, partisan presses, alleged objective, independently owned local presses. Oh, now we have radio, now we have TV, but on TV you had 3 channels, maybe a local channel to throw in too. Boom, now we have cable, then we hit social media. The sheer volume of media that you as a political consultant has to pay attention to has escalated exponentially, I would say.
Without question.
Yeah.
So you look for the biggest common area to be able to identify and speak to the target. So let's go back to something that I said earlier with my county executive race. Without question, this is going to be driven by women vote. Forget about, we can look at Democrat registration and Republican registration and blanks and independents, but this will be driven by women vote. By the way, the election of 2016, the presidential election, was driven by women vote. And strangely, they rejected the woman candidate. And the exit.
There's an argument to be made there. And let me just point out, and I think Jim was thinking the same thing. Electorally, they lost.
Electoral college.
The Electoral College.
Right.
However, by sheer numbers, the popular vote.
Sure.
Women in key states.
Wait.
Right.
So
Rejected her.
which, by the way, the Electoral College did exactly what it was designed to do.
Oh, yeah.
The combined winning margin of Hillary Clinton from New York and California combined was 6.5 million votes. and she won the popular vote by 4.75 million. So in other words, she lost the rest of the country. And the Electoral College did what it was supposed to do. But by the way, just for a second, those who talk about in a representative republic, the idea of a national popular vote,
it's
really,
Well, it comes down, but that comes down to demography and understanding demography, which I don't think the average person does.
Well, so I've been a proponent of moving all of the network news headquarters to Columbus, Ohio.
I was going to say Peoria.
Yeah, well, but I mean, the thing is that when I do elections around New York State, the people talking to themselves in the New York City newsrooms are just dramatic. That's pretty dramatic. They lose sight of the rest of the country. I mean, I really love the term flyover states. The fact that people, just say, oh yeah, we fly over them on our way from New York City to L.A. But this election locally will be driven by women vote. And what I said, by the way, the number I was speaking about was that exit polls, for whatever they're worth, my memory is it was like 53% of white female voters voted for Donald Trump. And therein was the election. I mean, you have a woman candidate on one side. My memory is that Madeleine Albright said there's a special place in hell for a woman that will not vote for a woman for president.
And as one of my friends said in his high school yearbook, hell is full of dirty housewives.
But even if we stay there for a minute, the idea that the medium is the message, mm-hmm. but it also means that the candidate has to be able to convey the message, in a media that's beneficial to him or her. And in Hillary Clinton's case, I'm sorry, she just wasn't likable.
Well, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier.
Well, right. And I mean, I go back and I think of Hillary as even a stiffer, meaner Al Gore.
So what ends up...
she's the Dick Nixon of the
exactly.
21st century.
Yeah, and that's a campaign breakdown. What you do is you expand your strengths, you manage your weaknesses, you don't put her in those situations, and her best moment, by the way, in that primary season prior to that election was when she was reduced to tears and was really real and said, because this is really important. That was the person that people could have voted for.
And there again, though, the medium becomes the message, and you have someone who is uncomfortable on camera.
Mm-hmm. So what you do, but by the way, so this county executive's race, I'm about to launch a really significant digital messaging campaign. And by that, we're talking about one-line responses to specific issues, which is interesting. So in other words, with one line, I have to write one line to define the immigration issue or one line to define a crime issue. And so we're dealing with superficial issues to drive significant behavior, and that's a little frightening. When we get to the point where, so in stages, I'll do digital messaging first. I'll go to social media, vehicles like Facebook, where I will go a little deeper. I'll also roll out my television ads earlier on paid push on social media. I'll target 2.3 million impressions, which means I'm going after the voting population 10 to 12 times. But that goes back to the medium as a message. Totally different kind of issues.
All right, but there's something else in here as well. And we've talked about demography. We've talked about the fact that you can look at a city and pretty much have an understanding of what's in the city. You can look at the heartland and have a pretty good understanding of what you're going to find there. And it gets into another science, which is psychographics, which is understanding how people think, how their moral compass is pointed, and so on.
And before we get there, should I suggest we remind our good listener what they're listening to?
This is Analogous Propinquity.
coming to you from beautiful downtown Fairport, New York, in the studios of Bill Moran.
So let's go to that question of, and what you were just referring to, Arnie, is getting into that. And part of what we're dealing with now, because the medium is the message, I'm not dealing with what we used to refer to as mass media. Right? There is no more, truly, I don't perceive any mass media. I choose what I want to get my news from.
And I call it, we exited the era of broadcasting into narrowcasting. And the difficulty in the messaging component is that if you stray too far to the narrowcasted message, then you're monitored all the time. So someone will say, so-and-so said this to this group, but said an opposite thing to another group. And that gets to be its own interesting dynamic. So, and we'll talk to the most explosive issue there is in elections, and that is abortion. So that for Republican candidates especially, because people have not historically had a good answer. So the male candidate could say, based on my faith, I am pro-life, but I will never tell a woman what to do with her body. Well, that may work to manage the women vote on his side, his party side, but it doesn't do anything to convert the other party's side.
Or the middle.
And so then and if you try to get cute with a second level of that message, you get hoisted on your own petard, if you will.
You've muddied your own message.
It does.
As soon as you do that.
And it also suddenly puts you in defensive posture. And when you're on defense in an election, you're losing. You have to continually move forward and frame message. As we're sitting here, the lesson for those people who want to do this is, it goes back to something we said at the beginning, is that if you start with a specific game plan and you say this is the way the election's going to roll out, you're going to lose. You have to, as you're sitting behind the horse, watch what the horse is telling you. In an election, I get up every morning and question my own decisions of yesterday, because, and that doesn't mean you hedge. I mean, once you believe, and this is something that you walked up to the line of talking about, Dr. Powers, if I believe that I have a message that's going to move the targeted vote that I'm going after, and that will be the swing voters. And I do think that, as we sit here, the immigration issue is going to drive a lot of swing vote. You may have to remind people that they vote in secret, but it is a legitimate issue. And then the question is, watching what I believe to be true, I can't measure it accurately. My instincts and my experience and my intuition tell me this is the right play. Are you willing to die on that hill? And that's the question that every strategist has to ask themselves. I mentioned in a prior one of our sessions that I did debate prep with the congressional candidate, and I had a head-on with his consultant because I said abortion was going to be a deciding issue in the New York 25th district, which it turned out to be. But the consultant didn't believe that, because the consultant was looking, well, that's only the sixth issue in polling right now. You go, no, it might be the sixth issue in polling, but that has nothing to do with the partisan intensity of the issue.
Right.
To drive out vote.
Let's take a look at that in the time we have left on this segment. I want to talk a little bit about, because Arnie, you have mentioned several times in our discussions that you are not any longer a great believer in polls. You would prefer a focus group.
Correct.
What is, and again, to turn on the medium and the message here, the analogy being, these are two different methods of gauging where that demography and the psychological state of your population is. Mm-hmm. What's the difference, and why do you prefer one or the other?
Well, the the fallacy of polling of today is that it's hard for you to build a targeted model because people don't have wired phones. We used to be able to determine the geography, and in fact, using Cluster Plus research, it was called, you target specific streets of like education and income and blah, blah, blah. In focus groups, you get 12 or 14 people around a table, and you introduce an issue, and you listen to their answer, and in fact, you repurpose their words into your messaging. And and if you're doing a focus group the right way, it is not, I can be looking at the person responding, but I am also watching the nonverbal responses of the people listening to that person respond. And so what I do is I set up a video camera. I don't like to use focus group facilities. Focus group facilities typically have a conference table,
Yep.
a two-way or a one-way mirror in the back, and you have people, watching the focus group. I don't like doing that because, especially with political candidates, they start trying to text you questions they want to, find out about. But if you're a good facilitator in a focus group, you can get people responding. The second thing that's being used, which, by the way, came from music research and radio stations, is called dial research, where you hand somebody a simulated radio dial, they listen to a speech, and when they are agreeing, they don't realize it, but they turn the dial up. When they're disagreeing, they turn the dial down, and then you measure what allowed them to turn it up. So again, yes, the medium has changed, but also the research method has changed. And, in a future cast, we can go through in a lot of depth why polling doesn't work anymore. But and by the way, I argue this with clients all the time. I do work for the New York State Republican Assembly Campaign Committee. They have moved me around the state doing focus groups, but not everyone in leadership believes in them. If they sit in a room and see them, they will. So the research methods are changing, the messaging methods are changing, the messaging vehicles are changing. The only constant is going to be change.
One quick follow-up, and this may be a simple no. When you're doing the focus group, does that help you know where then to narrowcast as well?
Yes.
Okay, because I was just thinking there might be a link that would be harder to get out of polling.
Yeah. Let's say you have a balanced room. You're watching women respond to an issue. You're also seeing how men are responding to the issue. So I may specifically target narrowly a women's message to women. I did a district attorney race one time, and with the woman candidate, Sandra Dorley, I had her say, a lot of people ask me what it's like to be Monroe County's first female district attorney. That was my squishy one, my squishy message, targeted to women. With men, it was 42% of this and 38% of this and a conviction rate of 96%, and it was purely statistical. Totally different messaging strategy, and that's the simple part, male-female.
Well, and I was going to say, that's based on the psychographic that women have one way of responding, men have a different way of responding.
I was told years ago, Paul, you and I worked in radio, and we used to say, women hear all the lyrics, understand the meaning of the song, they get involved with the song emotionally, and men hear do 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 do. And there's truth in that.
But that was one of the things that I learned in radio, was that you needed to know who your audience was, and you needed to know that intimately. I knew who I was talking to. Her name was Jenny, and I can tell you everything that you needed to know about her, and that's exactly who I was speaking to.
And in this county executive race that we've been talking about, my struggle is I know who that voter is and who that woman voter is. What I have to shed is their perception of what Republican male candidates are to break through.
I'm sorry. I'm going to challenge your guys' analogy. So notice how it worked part of our title?
Yeah, that's good.
Because when you say the men are the dum, da dum, da dum, I challenge it based upon my youth of going to bars. The women will dance, so they have to know the beat. The men have to be liquored up pretty good before we'd go out to the dance floor. So I'm just saying I'm not 100% convinced on your analogy. And
I would tell you that working in the era of radio where country music exploded,
Right.
that what I just said to you was beyond true.
I know that. The line
Eddie
dancing.
Rabbitt, Ronnie Millsap. They changed the industry.
Country music died when Merle died.
I think Kerry would have some disagreement with you on that one, James.
This crap they call country now ain't country, but that's another season.
Well, I was country when country wasn't cool, so there you go. Dr. James Bowers, political scientist, and Arnie Rothschild, marketing expert. We are talking about politics, where the past has been, and the past is prologue in a lot of ways. We will continue in our next segment to take a look at how the old gray mare just ain't what she used to be.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Analogous Propinquity comes to you from the Bill Moran Studios, Packett's Landing, Fairport, New York.